Chapter 41. Almost at once, tiredness, as we returned, attacked us. Allison discovered a blister on her left heel where the new shoe had rubbed. We wasted 10 minutes of the quick dying light trying to improvise a bandage for it, and then, almost as abruptly as if a curtain had dropped, night was on us. With it came wind. The sky remained clear. The stars burned frantically. But somewhere we went down the wrong rocky slope, and at the place I expected the refuge to be, there was nothing. It was difficult to see footholds, increasingly difficult to think sensibly. We foolishly went on, coming into a vast volcanic bowl, a stark lunar landscape, snow-streaked cliffs, violent winds, howling round the sides. Wolves became real, not an amusing reference in a casual conversation. Allison must have been far more frightened, and probably far colder than I was. At the center of the bowl it became clear that it was impossible to get out except by going back, and we sat for a few minutes to rest in the lee of a huge boulder. I held her close against me for warmth's sake. She lay with her head buried in my sweater, in a completely unsexual embrace, and cradling her there, shivering in that extraordinary landscape, a million years and miles from the sweltering Athens night, I felt it meant nothing. It must mean nothing. I told myself I would have felt the same with anyone, but I looked out over the grim landscape, an accurate enough simile of my life, and remembered something the muleteer had said earlier, that wolves never hunt singly, but always in a pack. The lone wolf was a myth. I forced Allison to her feet, and we stumbled back the way we had come. Along a ridge to the west, another col and slope led down toward the black, distant sea of trees. Eventually, we saw contoured against the sky a tor-shaped hill I had noticed on the way up. The refuge was just the other side of it. Allison no longer seemed to care. I kept hold of her hand and dragged her along by main force, bullying her, begging her, anything to keep her moving. 20 minutes later, the squat, dark cube of the refuge appeared in its little comb. I looked at my watch. It had taken us an hour and a half to reach the peak, and over 3 hours to get back. I groped my way in and sat Allison on a bunk. Then I struck a match, found the lamp, and tried to light it. But it had no wick and no oil. I turned to the stove. That, thank God, had dry wood. I ripped up all the paper I could find, a penguin novel of Allison's, the wrappings off the food we had bought, then lit it and prayed. There were back puffs of papery, then resinous smoke, and the kindling caught. In a few minutes the hut grew full of flickering red light and sepia shadows, and even more welcome heat. I picked up a pail. Allison raised her head. "I'm going to get some water now." "Okay," she smiled wanly. "I should get under some blankets." She nodded. But when I came back from the stream 5 minutes later, she was gingerly feeding logs through the upper door of the stove, barefooted, on a red blanket she had spread over the floor, between the bunks and the fire. On a lower bunk she had laid out what was to be our meal: bread, chocolate, sardines, paximadia, oranges. And she had even found an old saucepan. "Kelly, I ordered you to bed." I suddenly remembered I'm meant to be an air hostess, the life and soul of the crash. She took the pail of water and began to wash the saucepan out. As she crouched, I could see the sore red spots on her heels. "Do you wish we hadn't done it?" "No." She looked back up at me. "Just no?" "I'm delighted we did it." Satisfied, She went back to the saucepan, filled it with water, began to crumble the chocolate. I sat on the edge of the bunk and took my own shoes and socks off. I wanted to be natural, and I couldn't, and she couldn't. The heat, the tiny room, the two of us, in all that cold desolation. Sorry, I went all womany. There was a ghost of sarcasm in her voice, but I couldn't see her face. She had begun to stir the chocolate over the stove. Don't be silly. A squall of wind battered against the iron roof, and the door groaned half open. A squall of wind battered against the iron roof, and the door groaned half open. She said, "Saved from the storm." I looked at her from the door after I had propped it to with one of the skis. She was stirring the melting chocolate with a twig, standing sideways to avoid the heat, watching me. She pulled a flushed face and swiveled her eyes round the dirty walls. Romantic, isn't it? As long as it keeps the wind out. She smiled secretly at me and looked down at her saucepan. Why do you smile? Because it is romantic. I sat down on the bunk again. She pulled off her jumper and she shook her hair free. I invoked the image of Julie. But somehow it was a situation that Julie could never have got into. I tried to sound at ease. You look fine, in your element. So I should. I spend most of my life shaving in a 4x2 galley. She stood with one hand on her hip, a minute of silence. Old domestic memories from Russell Square. What was that Sartre play we saw? Huis clos. This is we even closer. Why? She kept her back turned. Being tired always makes me feel sexy. I breathed in. She said softly, one more risk. Just because the first tests are negative, it doesn't mean... She lifted a black-brown daub from the saucepan. I think this delicious consommé à la reine is ready. She came and bent beside me with that peculiar downwards look and automatic smile of air hostesses. Something to drink before dinner, sir? She thrust the saucepan under my nose, mocking herself and my seriousness, and I grinned, but she didn't grin back. She gave me one of her gentlest smiles. I took the saucepan. She went to the bunks at the far end of the hut, began to unbutton her shirt. What are you doing? Undressing? I looked away. A few seconds later, she was standing by me with one of the blankets wrapped sarong fashion round her, then quietly sat on another folded blanket on the floor, a careful 2 feet away from me. As she turned to reach for the food behind her, the blanket fell apart over her legs. She readjusted it when she turned back. But somewhere in the recesses of my mind, that little Priapus threw up his hands, and that other member of his body, and leered wildly. We ate. The paxamadia, rusks fried in olive oil, were as uninteresting as always, the hot chocolate watery, and the sardines inappropriate. But we were too hungry to care. Finally we sat. I had slipped onto the floor as well, satiated, backs against the edge of the bunk, adding more smoke to that from the stove. We were both silent, both waiting. I felt like a boy with his first girl, at the moment when the thing has to stop or to go on to the end. Frightened to make any move. Her bare shoulders were small, round, delicate. The end of the blanket she had tucked in under her armpit had become loose. I could see the top of her breasts. The silence grew acutely embarrassing, at least to me, a sort of endurance test, to see which of us would have to break it first. Her hand lay on the blanket between us for me to reach out and touch. I began to feel that she had exploited the whole situation, engineered everything to place me in this predicament. This silence in which it was only too clear that she was in command, not myself. Only too clear that I wanted her, not Allison in particular, but the girl she was, any girl who might have been beside me at that moment. In the end, I threw my cigarette into the stove and lay back against the bunk and shut my eyes, as if I was very tired, as if sleep was all I wanted. As indeed, bar Allison, it was. Suddenly she moved. I opened my eyes. She was naked beside me, the blanket thrown back. Allison, no. But she knelt and began to undress me. Poor little boy. She straddled my legs and unbuttoned my shirt, pulled it out. I shut my eyes and let her make me bare-chested. It's so unfair. You're so brown. She ran her hands up the side of my body, my shoulders, my neck, my lips, playing with me, examining me like a child with a new toy. She knelt and kissed the side of my neck, and the ends of her breasts brushed my skin. I said, I'd never forgive myself if... Don't talk, just lie still. She undressed me completely, then led my hands all over her body to know it all again, soft skin, small curves, slimness, her always natural nakedness. Her hands, as she caressed me, I thought, it's like being with a prostitute, hand as adept as a prostitute's, nothing but a matter of pleasure, and I gave way to the pleasure she gave me. After a while she lay on top of me, her head on my chest, a long silence. The fire crackled, burnt our legs a little. I stroked her back, her hair, her small neck, surrendered to the nerve ends in my flesh. I imagined lying in the same position with Julie, and I thought I knew it would be infinitely disturbing and infinitely more passionate. Not familiar, not aching with fatigue, hot, a bit sweaty, some cheapened word like randy, but why hot, mysterious, overwhelming passion. Allison murmured, shifted, bit me, swayed over me in a caress she called the Pasha caress, that she knew I liked, all men liked, my mistress and my slave. I remember our dropping into the bunk, a coarse straw mattress, the harsh blankets, her holding me a moment, kissing me once on the mouth before I could pull away, then turning her back, my hand on the wet breasts, and her hand holding it there, the small, smooth belly, the faint, washed and rain-washed smell of her hair, and then, in seconds, too soon to analyze anything, sleep. I woke up sometime in the night and went and drank some water from the pail. Small pencils of late-risen moon came through the old bullet holes. I went back and leant over Allison. She had thrown back the blanket a little, and her skin was a deep-shadowed red in the ember light, one breast bare and slightly slumped, her mouth half open, a slight snore, young and ancient, innocent and corrupt, in every woman, all woman. The wave of affection and tenderness I felt made me determine, with that sort of revolutionary shock ideas about courses of action sometimes have when one wakes up drugged with sleep, that tomorrow I must tell her the truth, and not as a confession, but as a means of letting her see the truth, that my real disease was not something curable like syphilis, but far more banal and far more terrible, a congenital promiscuity. I stood over her, almost touching her, almost tearing the blanket back and sinking on her, entering her, making love to her as she wanted me to, but not. I gently covered the bare breast, then picked up some blankets and went to the next bunk.